Well, welcome everyone. Let us pray. Dear God, creator of the earth, the sacred home we share, give us new eyes to see the beauty all around us and to protect the wonder of creation. Give us new arms to embrace the strangers among us, know them as family. Give us new ears to hear and understand those who live off the land and sea, and to hear and understand those who extract its resources. Give us new hearts to recognize the brokenness in our communities and to heal the wounds we have inflicted. Give us new hands to serve the earth and its people and to shape beloved community. For you are the one who seeks the lost, finds our wounds, and sets us free. It is the name of Jesus the Christ that we pray. Amen. Welcome back, everyone, to part 2 of Big Buildings, Big Questions. Tonight, we're creating space for some experts that tackle some of the questions that surfaced at our first gathering. It's my joy to introduce them both. Jim Nail is president of Massachusetts Interfaith Power and Light. For over 14 years, Jim has been putting faith into action for climate change. He's also a member of St. Dunstan's Episcopal Church, Dover, Massachusetts. Welcome, Jim.
Thank you.
And Paul Stevens is the Vice President of Marketing and Risk Management Services at Church Insurance. Paul has over 21 years of experience in client services. And he'll be with us again next Tuesday when Susan Albin facilitates a conversation about risk in our congregations. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you.
Jim and Paul, thank you both for making this time to be with us. Thank you.
Vicky, how do you want to go? Do you want me to start or Paul to start? How should we go here?
That's up to you guys. Why don't we start with you, Jim, since you have a PowerPoint?
Okay.
And then we'll spotlight
Great.
Paul in the next leg
All
of
right.
this.
Great. Let me do that. Get that up to. Oh, wait. Sorry about that. All right, here we go. I thought it was a really fascinating discussion that you all had last time. I was listening to the recording of it, making lots and lots of notes, and realized I'm going to throw one more big question at you, which is, with all of the various challenges that you talked about and the things you're trying to accomplish in your buildings and your ministries, I'm going to try to introduce here the idea of how do you weave environmental stewardship into it. And I don't want to scare you off. I know many of you are thinking, hey, we've got enough big things to deal with. How can you give us one more? But I think there are ways that it's actually very complementary to a lot of the things that you had talked about. And if approached correctly, it can really enforce and improve a lot of the things that you're thinking about, as well as give you access to some additional monies, which I'll talk about a little bit at the end. For those of you not familiar with this, quick plug for Massachusetts Interfaith Power and Light. We are a nonprofit here in Massachusetts. We are part of the National Interfaith Power and Light organization, which has about 40 state chapters around the country. And while we do represent all faiths and all faith traditions, which have many differences, of course, we all share this common concern for creation and trying to be faithful stewards of what God has given us. Our motto here is pray, act, and mobilize. So we're going to be talking a lot on the act of how do you care for these buildings? How do you lower your energy use, lower your carbon footprint? But prayer is very important. So Bishop Fisher, thank you for that to begin with. And really by that, we mean, how do we connect this idea of environmental stewardship to what we believe in our faith tradition, and how that is our call from God to care for creation. And of course, mobilization, very important to get the laws and regulations and things like that that move all of society forward in climate change. When we talk about buildings, one of our core offerings is what we call the environmental stewardship assessment. It's kind of our flavor of energy audit. And the reason we do this is that our buildings are kind of unique. In fact, every single church, synagogue, mosque, whatever that I've been in is architecturally and from a design standpoint, very different than any other building. So it's important to consider those unique things. And oftentimes auditors, energy experts who are more used to dealing with, homes or businesses or schools or retail stores don't get the nuances of our buildings, and therefore don't give us the optimal recommendations. And when we do one of these assessments, we attack these four kind of areas. Behavior, first of all, just paying attention to your energy use, which is something I think we all take for granted, that we can walk into a room and it's going to be warm or cool or comfortable, right? Or we just turn on the lights. Maybe it's a bright sunny day out, but we still turn on the lights. So if we think about some of those kinds of ways we use energy, you can actually start to lower that usage. Then, of course, electricity is a big user of energy. But I'll talk mostly, and I think most of the comments that came up in the last session were about what, in terms of sort of building, the building world, is called the building envelope. To put in plain words, that's the walls, doors, windows, roof, anything that separates the inside from the outside. And then, of course, the heating and cooling system, which is typically the largest user of energy in a building and is a large chunk of all of our budgets. And the reason, I'm going to take that focus is I heard these kinds of comments in the last session. People who were trying to rent out the buildings, but because they had inefficient heating systems, they'd have to charge really high rents to cover the cost of the extra energy that they would be using to make that available to a group. Water and humidity issues, mold, the created mold that now made certain spaces, particularly basements, just things you couldn't legally rent out, or you just were, very correctly not comfortable letting other people use those spaces. Slate roofs, the bane of many of our existences, but slate roofs that need repair, but gives you an opportunity to make some improvements. And even something that doesn't seem energy related, like improving the handicap accessibility. If you think about that, if you start opening walls or building a ramp and a new access point to the building, that gives you an opportunity to do some things you wouldn't normally do in terms of thinking about how to improve the energy use of the building. And all of this is, of course, made more and more important and urgent every day as we see more and more the impacts of climate change. This report that just came out from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change a month or so ago highlighted the fact that we're making some progress, but we are simply not making enough progress fast enough to keep the global temperature to a level that is going to be manageable. But again, we have the tools to combat it. We have the materials, we have the techniques, we have the technologies. So all of that I want you to start to begin thinking about in any of these projects you take on. Bringing it home closer here to Massachusetts now, a couple of years ago, the Baker administration issued this decarbonization roadmap. The science says we need to get to net zero by about 2050. How the heck do we do that? And I thought the Baker administration has laid out a very good roadmap, saying that, hey, we've got to get off fossil fuels wherever we can. There are some uses of fossil fuels that are harder to get rid of than others, but certainly in buildings, that's very very doable. Energy efficiency combined with moving away from fossil fuel heating systems to electrified heating systems, is not only important for the environment, but better comfort, less noise, better resiliency of the building, improved ventilation and air quality, all things, again, that came up in the last session. And these things rely on these infrequent opportunities, like when you're replacing your heating system. You only do that every 15, 20, 30, 40 years. So when that's coming up, you really need to think carefully about it and move toward these lower carbon opportunities. So again, as I said before, most of my discussion here, and I know there's lots of questions about, how do you plan for a heating system replacement? And sadly, I've been involved with many members who don't plan, and we get a call some cold February day when it's been 0 degrees, and they tried to have their service the day before, and the furnace or the boiler wouldn't start up. Really much more important to not have the attitude of, hey, it's still working. Yeah, it may be old, but as long as it works, we're not going to think about it. And quite frankly, to achieve that state goal of decarbonizing, it's pretty likely that 80–90% of you should be planning a heating system replacement by 2030 in any case. And the rest of you, if you can accelerate a replacement to lower your carbon emissions, that would be a wonderful thing. And the building envelope, the most important thing there is if you can better insulate the building, make it tighter, replace, like in this particular building, single pane windows with more efficient windows. You need less heat, so you will use less fuel of any sort. And certainly as you're moving toward electrification, that makes that process much easier, makes your bills lower going forward, and is an action that really pays off well. And it sounds like a really crazy thing. Like, how are we going to take these old buildings and radically reduce the energy use and make them net zero or what have you? This is South Church, Amherst, and I think this dates back now 7 or 8 years ago when they achieved net zero emissions, reduced their energy use by 70%. And as you can see, that building is not new. I think it was about 1880s, 1890s. They had a fantastic team out there, some really smart people who rolled up their sleeves and did a plan. And as you can see, over 6 years, they plotted out what exactly are we going to do? What order are we going to do these things in? And I think they had a really good approach that I think is very appropriate for most of you out there. How do you, things like replacing windows and moving away from incandescent lighting to LED lighting, then getting into replacing the heating system with a modern heat pump kind of system. And those, you've got a couple of big things done there, and then just continually looking for what are the next, maybe smaller opportunities, but every little bit helps there. And a little more insulation here, tightening up a door and weather stripping it there. So it is doable in these buildings. But let's talk about money. That came up a lot. It is always a big problem. One of the things that we have written about and we talk about is this idea of establishing a budget line for energy efficiency investments in the church budget. Budgets get paid attention to by most of the members. Budget lines get attention and get thought put into them. So if you can incorporate this thinking into the financial component of your congregation, as well as sort of the physical management of the building, it can really help get that kind of focus and attention to it. And I won't go through this whole chart. I will share this paper with Vicki, if I haven't already, and take a look at it. But the basic idea is on that top line, if you do nothing, your energy expenses are going to go up. I did this a couple of years ago when inflation was still 3%, so it's even more than that. But, if you think about this expense going up year over year, and then start to think about, well, how much can we reduce it? The idea is in the first year, you make a few modest changes and a few modest investments, and you save a little bit of money. But rather than cut the budget, take that money and budget it into this energy efficiency budget line. So you start with the first year, if you can squeeze out, say, $1,000, $1,500, maybe you get a $2,000 or $3,000 payback. You put that money into the next year. Now, the next year, you've got more money. You can take on some bigger projects. That creates more savings. You get more money the next year, and so on and so on. That's the general idea. And again, there's more detail in that paper. But I think, again, just putting that rigor and that focus on it is really the intent of this idea. Many of you talked about Mass Save. Some of you maybe weren't as aware of Mass Save. Always the first place to start. I like to say that our assessment is different than a Mass Save assessment, because what Mass Save is really looking at is which of our incentives do you qualify for? And so things like windows, they don't really offer much of an incentive. So typically their assessors don't really do any evaluation of your windows. But when it comes to insulation, air sealing, heat pumps, that's really the focus of the program these days. So anytime you're thinking about that kind of project, be sure to get in touch with Mass Save. And if you're in a municipal area, which I know a number of you are, you don't have access to Mass Save, but often those municipal companies have their own kind of program. And sometimes it's quite good. I was at a church in Sterling over the winter, and the Sterling Municipal Company had a pretty good energy efficiency program themselves. So be sure to look to those sources. The Inflation Reduction Act, which you may remember was passed and signed into law last August, did a really, really interesting and important thing. It took the tax credits that have been available for things like this in the past. Of course, we don't pay taxes. Tax credit doesn't do us any good. We can't access it. Well, the Inflation Reduction Act turned it into what they call direct pay, i.e., when you do one of these qualifying projects, submit the paperwork to the Treasury cuts you a check for up to 30% of the cost. Now, there's still a lot of details that we're waiting to hear about exactly what kinds of projects will qualify. Are there some caps on some of these things? But particularly for things like solar, the 30% is available now. So that makes a huge difference. And a month or two ago, I did a webinar with a couple of member churches who were in the process of installing solar. And they talked specifically about how they were going a different route to pay for their solar project. And then when they heard about this direct pay provision, they changed course and went to a straight purchase of the project. And I can get that link to Vicki as well. So keep an eye on more information coming out about that, I'm sure. This from back in the fall, the Catholic Climate Covenant did a nice recap of this, which is worth viewing as a basic, and then again, keeping up on updates that are coming out now. The rewiringamerica.org site is a great site for keeping up on these things. One provision of the IRA that I haven't heard a lot about except on this site is this commercial buildings energy efficient credit. So I know a number of you, talk about you're renting it out to a school or a daycare group or other sorts of groups. So now you probably will qualify for this kind of commercial credit, $2.50 to $5 per square foot if you can achieve these kinds of energy reductions. And then these environmental and climate justice block grant programs. Again, I haven't seen any detail on that, but that money's floating around somewhere. I believe that comes to the state, and then the state creates a program. So again, we're keeping our eye out for details on those. But more and more of that kind of money will be coming available. But the really key thing is to begin planning early. If you have a heating system that's over 15, 20 years old, you definitely need to be planning now, because it's going to take you a couple of years to figure out what to do, talk to some engineers, talk to some contractors, raise the money to do it. But I think if you begin planning now, and in a year or so, you've got a good idea what you're going to do, how much it's going to cost, then you've got a good opportunity to go to some of those government grant programs and say, hey, we've got a shovel-ready project. We would love to get that help. I also encourage you, and I always encourage all of our members, to get expert help on these kinds of projects, whether that's a building science consultant for a heating system, a mechanical engineer. These are harder projects than in the past. If you had a gas furnace, 5 years ago and replaced it 5 years ago, yeah, you could have your HVAC contractor come in. They looked at the furnace. They go, oh, it's this size. Here's a new one that same size. We'll plop that right in. Pretty straightforward. Moving to heat pumps and electrifying is a little bit different. So it's worth investing a little bit of money to get it done right. But no, it's going to take time. It's going to take effort. It is going to take money. So you're going to have to be really attentive to that and make the right investments of skills and focus to do that. And stay in touch with me and with Mass IPL as we get more details and see more details being published by the Treasury or by the IRS about these different programs and things coming out of the state. We share that in our newsletter on a regular basis. So hope that's a helpful background to start with. So with that, Paul, all yours.
Thank you, Jim. That's excellent information. I just wanted to add on a few things that Jim brought up that they intersect with insurance, believe it or not. The first is, if the church insurance company has an endorsement that's on all policies that we write, and it's called the Green Building Coverage Endorsement. And what that means is if there's a covered claim, let's say there's a fire at the church and we're rebuilding the church, the Green Building Coverage form provides that you can replace things in a greener way. So if we talk about VOCs, which are volatile organic compounds, we're talking about replacing old things that maybe have an impact on air quality that's negative with things that don't. We're talking about low flow toilets, LED lighting, up to $5,000 for an LEED certified engineer to help put together a plan for you. But I just want to point that out, that is an endorsement that's on all the policies we write. If you're insured with church insurance and you have a covered claim, that can come into play. So a good intersection with Jim's information. The second thing, Jim talked about it, maintenance budget. Maintenance budget, I've been doing church insurance for 21 years now. Risk management's really what I'm accredited in. The first thing out the window is the maintenance budget. And just to put this in perspective, this is something people can wrap their heads around. If you look at a typical building, and churches aren't typical, as Jim brought up, but a typical building has a useful life of 40 years. That's, the rule of thumb. They say in that 40 years, 40% of the total cost of that building is when you construct the building. 60% is maintaining the building. Now, if we start to think about our churches that last way beyond 40 years, you can see how maintenance becomes an ongoing target that we have to focus on. And frankly, we see a lot of deferred maintenance, and it's understandable. When you think about, hey, the ministry dollars can only go so far. But what I want to throw out is a number. You know, the number is on the low end, 1% of the building value per year. So, for example, I was just meeting with some folks down south in Florida. They're in a building that was designed for 500 people 100 years ago. You know, now on a Sunday, if there's 50, you know, that's a pretty good day. It's a $30 million replacement cost on that building, which means their annual budget for maintenance should be $300,000, which would wipe out their total budget. So of course, you get into a snowball effect of deferred maintenance, which ultimately I was picking up on some of the things you were talking about, where you want to use the building for something else, but if the building's not well maintained, it makes it another struggle to do that. So maintenance budgets are a big thing as much as you can, but just to give you a rule of thumb, 1% of what that replacement cost of that building is every year. So you can, and if you think about that at your house, I was thinking about it like that. I'm like, yeah, pretty much every year, about 1% of this value in this money pit I live in. And the last thing he talked about that I thought intersected with insurance real well was he's talking about climate change. And you might say, well, climate change, what's the impact of that? What's the intersection with insurance? And it's an intersection with premium ultimately. And what we're seeing is whatever you want to call it. I call it climate change. When I'm down in the South, a lot of folks call it I call it the weather's worse. Okay. The storms are worse. They're more often. They cost more. We just had Hurricane Ian, by far the largest weather-related event Church Endurance has had in its 90-plus year history. Bigger than Katrina, bigger than Sandy, bigger than all of them. And we're seeing it more often. And a lot of it has to do with the warming of the planet. So how does that affect insurance? Well, when there's more losses and more claims, premiums go up, reinsurance goes up. You're in a situation down in Florida, for example, where it's almost becoming uninsurable. I was reading a statistic the other day that said by the year 2050, 75% of all property claims will happen in the state of Florida. That's tied to weather. So some great intersections there, Jim. I agreed everything you had to say. I liked everything you had to say. What I've been brought in to talk about, as I understand it, is just some experiences I've been having with alternative uses of buildings. Okay, so I'm going to touch on that. I'm by no means a real estate expert. I'm a risk manager of the Episcopal Church, but I intersect with people that are dealing with these issues. So I'm going to give you a couple scenarios. Some will sound familiar. The first scenario is the hardest scenario. We have a building that was built a long time ago for a lot more people than there are now. It's in the spiral of deferred maintenance. There's no budget for maintenance. It's hard to keep up with just the ongoing expenses of the buildings. In a way, the buildings start to saddle the congregation, what they can do. They're spending so much time on the building. The building's located in an area where no one wants the land. There's not a big opportunity to sell the building. So that's the hardest one. You know, and a lot of times I get into that, you know, down in Alabama, I've got some in mind that I think about where these are churches where the diocese ultimately comes in and says, you know, if anything happens to this building, we're not going to rebuild it. And in fact, we're just going to tear it down. That's a big, heavy call to make for any bishop, for any congregation, to know that, hey, if the roof gets hail, we're not fixing it, we're tearing it down. And we're moving in a different direction. That's one extreme. And that's situations where you have buildings that are places that aren't easily sold, aren't easily used for another purpose. And every diocese, all 106, 109 of them have it. Okay, they all have a certain percentage that fall in this realm. So we all know those. So, but I'm going to talk about the other side of this. And it's been exciting, it's been interesting to me, and I've learned quite a bit. And it's buildings that are located in, it's the same scenario. We've got a building that doesn't fit our needs anymore. We've got decades of deferred maintenance. We don't have the money to do it, but the building's in a really good location. So I'll give you a couple examples of things I've seen recently. The first one, pretty simple, Nashville, Tennessee, cathedral downtown, beautiful building. But as an urban cathedral, folks have moved out to the suburbs, so the average Sunday attendance isn't what it used to be, but still doing okay. But they're looking forward. One thing they had as an asset was a surface parking lot adjacent to the rear of the cathedral. And it just had probably 40 spots that they'd use on Sunday, and they'd actually rent those spots out during the week to business folks. And that was a pretty good revenue stream, but for what I'm getting ready to tell you, it was small potatoes for where they ended up. So what they ended up doing is they went into a 100-year land lease with Hilton. Hilton's going to put up a 35-story hotel, luxury hotel, on what was that parking lot. This is going to generate 7-figure revenue to the cathedral and the diocese every year for the next 100 years. At which time I'll be gone. I don't know what'll happen, but that's what's happening there. So what have they done? Well, part of that deal is the first 4 floors of the Hyatt or the Hilton will be a parking garage. So on Sunday, the church will have access to those parking spots. So that problem solved. Second thing, the big thing, the revenue. 7-figure, and it escalates. We're talking about a 100-year deal. The third thing about it is liability. Whose is it? It's Hilton's. I mean, we own the land, the church owns the land, but the real liability of the hotel operation will rest with Hilton. So they've lowered their liability, they've increased their revenue, and they still have their parking. So that's just an example. And that's a place, if you've been to Nashville, Tennessee, we're talking 9th and Broadway, it's boom town. So that's what that is. Second one, similar, different location. This is down in Florida on the water. It's an old cathedral parish hall that they weren't even using. It was in such bad shape they couldn't use it anymore. Similar story, 99-year land lease. And they're going to build luxury condominiums, 40-story tall, on this spot, on this little postage stamp that was once a cathedral parish hall. They're going to do a thing called in kind, means they're going to give them a chapel inside this condo that they'll be able to use as their parish hall, their meeting spot. 7-figure income for the next 100 years, escalates. It gets into 8 figures, 50 years out, things like that. Again, limited their liability, created a huge revenue, and they still are going to have their little chapel for the folks that show up at that church, at that cathedral. So that's an example, another example of it. So and what's the bottom line with this? And so there's a gentleman, and I hate to give his name out because I know he's got a full dance card, but you may hear of him. He works at a presiding bishop's office. His name is Lang Laurie. Lang Laurie once ran Minolta. And I always joke with him that he made so much money at Minolta that he ended up at the seminary and he became a rector. Okay. And then he was a rector for a decade or two, and then got to the end of that and started to get into what I'm talking about, which is putting churches together with developers to come up with these innovative ways to utilize church assets, i.e. buildings or land. So you may hear of him, you may know of him. He's all over, and he's spread pretty thin. So, I can always try to connect you, Vicki. I've got a call into Lang, and then I just saw a press release that he had given up his clergy work to do more of this stuff. So I think the wheel's in motion with that. But he works at a presiding bishop's office, so he's doing this all over. But one of the things I learned from Lang is this. A lot of times churches and dioceses think the answer is we sell it. We're not using it. We don't need it. We need something smaller. We sell it. What I learned from Lang is it's 2 choices. If it's valuable land, you never sell it. You lease it. You lease that land forever. It's because it's likely always going to be valuable land. And then, like I said in the first example, if it's not valuable land, that's a harder nut to crack. That's more of, I have dioceses literally would give things away if they could, if somebody would take it. So anyway, I just want to give you some perspective on some of the unique and innovative approaches I'm seeing And I know that doesn't fit everyone, but it probably fits some of your folks. So to that extent, whether it's a parking lot that could be something else, or if it's, we don't need this building. I've also seen churches where they're, you know, the ASA 50 years ago was 400 and now it's 20, and they walk away from the building, they sell it, they give it away, and they basically get a storefront somewhere. So they can continue their ministry, but lower their overhead, lower their liability. Now, all these things are hard. We have an emotional attachment to these buildings. Most of us do. Wherever you go to church, that's the church I went to as a kid. I want it the exactly same way. That's where I want to be buried, out of that church. So we understand, and I understand. I'm not trying to tell anybody these are easy decisions. They're not. I was just at a church in Jacksonville, Florida last week, and the rector was leading the folks to this. And he had already talked to Lang Laurie. I should have known. And what the church you're looking at is a $30 million building for, 50 people on a Sunday. And what the rector's leading the congregation to is this the best stewardship? And what could we have if we tore down 3 of the 4 buildings and just left the church? Or if we leveled everything and let a developer do their thing and give us an in-kind chapel, or if we moved somewhere else. So these are kind of conversations, but I could tell in that meeting, not everybody was there yet. Like, everybody can kind of see it. We, if you put numbers in front of people, you can see the spiral and where it's headed, but it's still hard. And we understand that, I totally do. So anyway, with that, I'll open it up to any questions folks have and do my best to answer them.
Thanks a lot, Paul. You're right. It's good to think outside the box and to be creative and not narrow your options as you consider where God is leading your community. I've put the spotlight back on both Jim and Paul, and I'm going to be looking at the participants list. So if you've got a question, just raise your Zoom hand and we'll get you engaged talking with these wonderful guests.
And I did see a comment in the chat that was answered, but the question was, does Mass Save work with churches? Some people are told, no, Mass Save doesn't work with churches. And that is wrong. They do. I have heard that occasionally some of the subcontractors they use for the assessments will say that. I don't know whether they're lazy or for whatever reason don't want to work with churches, but you are paying into the Mass Save funds. If you're National Grid, Eversource, Unitil, there's a line item on your bill every month that pays into it. So you should get money back out of it. If you hear that, you need to, you can call back the Mass Save number and say you heard this and it's wrong. You need a different auditor, or get in contact with me. Because I know a lot of the people at the various, the different utility groups, and I'll do whatever I can to make sure you get access to that program.
We have a question from Stephen Hussey.
Yeah, that's for Paul. If there's a building, say there's a building that the church can't use anymore, and they'd love to lease the land, and they lease it out with the understanding that the building can be destroyed, but the person who leases it decides not to. Is there still liability on the church's part if they keep the building as it is?
Yes, because you own the building. So these are things you want hammered out in the deal with the developer, whoever the developer is here's what's got to happen for the deal to happen. And what you're looking for in that scenario, Stephen, is revenue, reduced cost on your insurance, and reduced liability risk.
Oh, yeah, thanks.
Good question.
And Julia Dunbar has a question.
Well, I wanted to thank you for clarifying about Mass Save, because we did have Mass Save come and do an audit of the church, which we ended up selling. And they certainly would do work, but it's just that they would have to charge us money that we wouldn't there wasn't a financial break, but this was about 5 years ago. So, and I'm the one that met with the auditor, so I know what he said. But it's good to know that that's not the case. So,
Yeah, now sometimes, particularly 5 years ago, the Mass Save program is really a financially oriented program, not a climate change oriented program. So after they would do an assessment, they would do some calculations about how much energy they could save and, therefore how much money that would save everybody. And then they would base the amount of incentives on that. And in a church that's used relatively few hours per week, yes, you would get lower incentives than if it were a commercial building or a home. So that does happen.
thank you.
Thank you, Julia, for the question. Mimi, bringing you in.
Great, thank you. Hi, we have a slate roof, and you had a line item on one of your presentation about slate. I'd love to hear a little bit about economical ways to replace slate or repair, and what your suggestion is from a climate perspective, but also long-term. I mean, slate, right, we have a quote for repairing slate with slate, and it has a significant longevity. So curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah. I mean, that is one of the good things about slate. It's a natural material. It's mined, so there are some impacts from that, but it's a natural material. And typically, it does have a lifetime of 75 plus years. In my town out here, we have an old state mental hospital that is being refurbished. And it goes back to the 1890s. And when I was talking with the town person who's sort of the caretaker of it and saying, gee, whoever the developer is, they're going to have a lot of money replacing all this slate because it's 125 years old. And he was like, actually, no, it's still in really good condition. There's always repairs on slate, but it can last a long, long time. So those are definitely the good sides of it. But yeah, it's really expensive. So, there's that piece of it. And quite frankly, there's always maintenance, and the maintenance is expensive. And it gets into one of those, kind of emotional attachment things that Paul talked about, because it is a beautiful material. And on these old, Gothic style buildings or, stone buildings or things, it is just a fantastic look. There are some very good imitation slate materials. Some of them are like plastics and composites and things like that, but some are even like ceramics and materials that are a little bit more similar. So, but it's just a challenge. The thing there from a climate change standpoint is often those roofs, you've got the slate right on top of the roof sheathing with no insulation, then to the interior of the building. Adds a little bit more cost to the project, but if you can add a rigid insulation board on top of the roof and then put the new roofing material on top of that, you can pretty dramatically reduce the energy use of the building. So if it were up to me, but where my biases are here, I would go for a lower cost, imitation slate material and put the cost into adding the insulation.
And Mimi, if I could add, with regard to the expense of like maintenance, things like that, how can you economically deal with slate? One of the things you can think about when you're talking to your roofer or your contractor on this is the concept of harvesting tile. Okay, so what that means is, let's say we have a roof that has many different slopes. So it's got the big one like this, but then it's got some side ones and little ones over here. So the big one, everyone can see it, right? That's the visual point. So what we'll see from time to time, because we get into this with claims, is where we'll say, yeah, what we could do, you've got 20 broken pieces and the mine is closed, you know, it was 200 years ago. And we can come in with the imitation and try to blend it in. You know, nah, I don't know about that. Or we can harvest from a lower slope that no one sees, put those tiles where they do see it, put the imitation on the lower slope no one sees. From the naked eye, you don't notice any difference. So if it's helpful at all, you might mention that to your contractor and say, hey, what about the concept of harvesting some tiles and then on the lower slopes going with, like Jim said, the imitation that is a pretty close match.
We certainly can ask about that. Right now, we're talking about a repair job, so it's not necessarily even a full section.
Okay.
So yeah, I'll have to find out a little bit more.
Keep that in the back of your mind, harvesting.
Yeah, that's
a really
excellent.
good idea.
Thank
Really
you. And I'm sure there's others with slate roofs.
A lot of slate roofs.
Yeah.
A lot of slate.
Good.
We've still got about 13 minutes for questions. Julia. You have to unmute.
There. The dilemma is, or one of the dilemmas is, we have this, you know, beautiful church with a very roof. And I mean, who knows how long the churches will, any church will survive. The state of the Episcopal Church is, you know, similar to many other places. So, I mean, I love it when I hear about places where they're meeting in the, you know, the pub on Sundays when it's closed, or, you know, these different creative solutions. And it's just it seems like it's a hard path, you know, it's a hard path to figure out what makes sense, what actually makes sense here. So yeah, that's where we are.
I'm sorry, Jim. Go ahead.
No, good. I really appreciated Paul's comments about that, because a few years ago we showed up at a church to do an assessment. There was like yellow police tape around their steeple. You know, it's a big stone brick building. Yeah. And we're like, what's that about? It says, well, you know, there's all these structural problems. It's leaning, you know, we have to, you know, figure out how to fix that. It's really expensive. And we said to them, you know what? Until you know you can afford to fix that, we're not going to do the assessment for you, because there's no point fixing the rest of the building if that's going to fall down and you've got to deal with that. So, and it may be, you know, and that's a case where it's so expensive. I don't know what happened finally at the church, but that's one of those things where it wouldn't have surprised me at all that they had to make the decision. Nope, we have to take it down because we can't afford to repair it at this point.
And that gets right back to the topic of deferred maintenance. That was obvious. There was obviously a time where that would have been fixable and affordable. That time's passed. And to your point, Julia, you know, really, when you start thinking about what do we really need for our ministry in the 21st century, based on the size of this particular congregation or whatever. And I'm going to say something that's a real business term, but it's something that I think people need to think about. And it's financial sustainability of that congregation. What's financially sustainable for whatever that horizon is? And those are the tough questions, like you said.
Yep. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm looking for hands.
There's a hand waving.
Oh, a physical hand waving.
Physical hand waving.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, Tom Doherty, you're on.
Thank you, Vicki. Paul and Jim. So I belong to Grace Church in Amherst, and it's a fairly big campus with a church. Granted, stone church with a very steep slate roof on the church, but then we have a rectory, we have a connector between the rectory and the church. The rectory is a flat roof, it's asphalt. We have a parish hall, and we have a park house, which is where we have had our Sunday school. Although once COVID started, Sunday school kind of went away and it's coming back a little bit. We're just not seeing the families and the children that we have in the past. One parishioner who remains to be anonymous has stepped forward and said he'd like to replace the park house. It's fairly old. It's 2 stories, has a basement, and then it's 2 stories high. The basement is totally unusable, though our heating system is down there. But structurally, it doesn't look, it seems okay. Although the age of it, I think there's probably lead paint, used on the inside. Some of the outside needs some work. But this anonymous donor, I said they'll replace this park house for us. And I struggle with, we're going to replace it, which sounds nice, and put new Sunday school rooms in there. But to use these rooms for 2 hours a week it just seems crazy.
Yeah. So Tom, does it make you think that this anonymous donor has an emotional attachment to this specific building?
Yes, and this donor, wants us to attract, families, more, so we've got this beautiful old church, but then, this park house is fairly old too, and it's a little drab. But we also are in a section of town where we're on the historical map, so we really can't do things very quickly here. Yep. But I scratch my head with, I like the idea of what they did in Nashville. I don't know if we could put a Hilton in the middle of Amherst, but we have no parking also. At the church. We have to get a permit, or the rector and the assistants that work in the rectory have to get permits from the town to park on the street. But it seems like, again, I struggle with to put up a new building for Sunday school for 2 hours a week. And I've talked to this donor about, these rooms should be multi-purpose so we can rent them out.
Yes.
But how do you, it's pretty tough to use a room for Sunday school for 2 hours a week, and then somebody's going to want to, work out of an office in that same room. And that, it's so Jim, you do assessments. Is there what is the quote cost for something like that? We've had Mass Save. We've had Mass Save about every 5 years. We get Mass Save in. So we've gone to the LED lighting. We had them in 2 years ago. Some of our heating systems, we have 4 of them. We have 2 oil and 2 gas. And the oil in the rectory is getting up there in age. But we looked at heat pumps, and it was $84,000, $14,000 rebate from the state, so that was $60,000. But we only spend $3,000 a year in oil, so that's a 20-year payback. I couldn't sell it. I just couldn't sell it to the parish. Let's go and do this. Let's just stay with the oil right now.
We should talk offline, because that $84,000 theme.
Well, it was two. Anyway.
So we can talk offline about that, but
Okay.
we have a modest charge for our assessments from $395 to $995. We scale it based on your church budget. And it's a 30-40 page report, pictures, which not only is it good for your energy use, but as a property chairman of my church, when I took on the property chairman, there was no documentation of any of the systems or any of the aspects of the building. So this is also a useful document for that. But to your other question, I'm kind of excited by that possibility, because now you've got kind of a blank slate. And like Paul was talking about, the in-kind agreements that some of those churches had about, yes, we're going to have a chapel here. Well, great, you get an in-kind agreement like that. We're going to have our Sunday school classrooms here, but the rest of the building, is rentable. And really think about it kind of more from the standpoint of what kind of space is rentable in Amherst today? What kind of groups are
Mm.
looking for space, and can you build something with that and then carve out your little corner of it?
Right,
Um,
right. And the
the-
town does need spaces, and we've already talked to the
Yeah.
town hall, and we do rent it out to
Yeah.
some organizations right now.
Yeah. And,
So Jim, so after this, when we're done, is there a phone number or an email
Yeah.
where I can talk to you offline,
Sure, sure.
later today or tomorrow or whatever?
yeah, take this at jnail, JNAIL @massipl.org.
Would you say that one more time?
Jnail
Now,
at massipl.org, massipl.org.
thank you.
And I'm a Williams man, but it's okay. I'll come to Amherst.
Oh, well, I'll invite you when they're playing soccer against Williams or whatever, football or basketball or lacrosse.
Exactly.
Okay. I think we have time for one more question.
Vicki, I'd just like to add the presentation next week on risk management. We're going to be talking about the use of, renting out your buildings and the kinds of things you need to consider when you're doing that. So it'll be a continuation of some of what we talked about tonight, but a slightly different look at it.
That's great, Susan. You read my mind to promo what's happening next Tuesday. That meeting will be at 5 o'clock. It's for Wardens and Vestry. But if you're into this, you join us. I'm bringing back our bishop and our canon to the ordinary. So we can all just thank you for being with us tonight. It's been really great to have two experts among us. And I'll let our bishop have the last word tonight.
Well, thank you, Jim and Paul. Thank you for there was such practical advice. We really appreciate that. And the context of every place is different. It really is. And so, but we also want you to know that even though your context is different, you are not alone. That you're part of a diocese that's with you, is trying to make choices with you. So the context is different, but again, everyone is united in our diocese for these resources. And so we thank you tonight for Vicki for bringing everybody together. We appreciate that. And as you go through these decisions, do not hesitate to contact my office. So we will walk with you in these decisions. So thank you for that.